Hey, the video you left last, or the comment you guys left last night gives me a chance to try out my new tablet's video capabilities here in the hotel, and whatever. So there's two questions that were left. One was, can you still call something good or bad, good or evil, even if you don't appeal to God? Now, you can always call anything you want, of course, and also there are ways to objectively decide what people ought to think is good. You can do Kant's categorical imperative, or some economists will say, what kind of world would everybody want to live in? I mean, there are thought experiments by which you can try to work on that sort of idea in terms of interpersonal ethics. But when it comes right down to saying this thing is good or this thing is evil, whether or not anybody agrees with it, that is, what logically protects the minority from the majority, for example, those sorts of things. Historically, in philosophy, it's been notoriously difficult to demonstrate that something is good or evil on the basis of logic alone without appealing to some kind of authority. I guess the best example I can give of this is I took a graduate class in ethics from a professor who was teaching at Oxford at the time. We read Peter Singer, a very well-known Princeton philosopher's edited book on ethics. Lots of really good philosophers took shots at trying to establish the basis for ethics without appealing to God. And after reading 500 pages of that, I was really unmoved. What I came away with was, what we do know is that the one thing we do know is it's extremely difficult to come up with a basis of ethics without appealing to God. Probably the best, I think, is G.E. Moore's intuitionism. That is, we just know innately what's right or wrong. But the problem with intuitionism has always been, how do we have the intuitions? An atheist is going to appeal to evolutionary history, and once you appeal to evolutionary history, not killing each other is as morally connotated as having an appendix. It is something that's there. It's not objectively right or wrong, depending on, irrespective of who believes it or whatever. It just isn't true or false. Anyway, so I would say, and a lot of very well-known atheists have agreed to this. A.J. Ayer, well-known philosopher in the last century, made very clear that he believed that when we said things were right or wrong, we were basically just stating preferences. David Hume, the famous 18th century philosopher, was very clear when he said, when you start talking about ethics, you're in the realm of values rather than the value of facts. And the minute you get into the realm of values, it's notoriously difficult to try to figure out true or falsity. And so he recognized that. And in modern times, philosophers as well known as Richard Dawkins will say, you can be good without God, but when they're actually pressed on the question of where do we get our ethics from, they have a very difficult time. For example, on NPR with Terry Gross, Richard Dawkins said he's very happy that there was the evolutionary accident of human morality, but that's all it really is. It's a coping mechanism for natural selection that human beings developed in tribal systems throughout the world. Now, that's all well and good as an explanation, but that doesn't make not killing your neighbor right or wrong objectively. The fact remains it is extremely difficult to do that. Secondly, the idea of if God does have some purpose in there being multifaceted purposes in suffering, why doesn't he just speak to us? And it's important to make the distinction between something that's logically proven and something we find implausible. Lots of people find the fact that God doesn't speak to us directly, that makes his existence implausible. That's not the same thing as proving he cannot exist, which is what the comment sort of insinuated, that we know that if God exists, he should speak in relationship to suffering. That's not philosophically valid. You can find it practically implausible. If there was really a good God, why wouldn't he speak? That just doesn't make any sense that he wouldn't. That's finding it implausible. It's another thing to say it is logically impossible for God to exist given that he doesn't speak in suffering. That's much more difficult to prove, and historically nobody's been able to prove it philosophically. People take shots at it. You'll find it in popular books by Sam Harris's and Richard Dawkins's and people like that, but you will not find serious philosophers usually thinking that they can do it, because you can't. And so you have to ask the question, and then you have to ask the question, are things that we find implausible true? Well, sometimes they're true, sometimes they're not. So you've got to go on these to merit. But I've had many experiences in my life where things I thought were very implausible turned out to be true when I looked into them more deeply. Oftentimes, when we find something implausible, it's because it's implausible and it's false. Other times we find things implausible, it's just because we haven't really thought about them carefully enough and we really don't see deeply why, though they look false, they're in fact true. Hope that helps.